happening. You know that old song, We're in the Money? You might hear a few Washington politicians humming that tune today, thanks to a well-greased economic machine that, like that battery-powered bunny, just keeps on ticking. The federal government is ending the fiscal year this week flush with cash, apparently, $230 billion in surplus, the largest surplus in U.S. history. President Clinton did a little election year crowing, mentioning Al Gore by name at least twice. As he ran down the numbers, Mr. Clinton says $223 billion of the surplus went toward the national debt, and he says there's something in that for you. Like we said, it's an election year.
Paying off the debt will benefit America, just as paying off credit cards benefits the average family. It frees up money for things that matter, and it keeps interest rates lower. That will mean more investment, more jobs, lower mortgage payments, car payments, and student loan payments.
Washington posted its first surplus since the Vietnam War era in 1998, $69 billion. It's almost doubled the next year to $124 billion, and now in 2000, the surplus has just about doubled again to $230 billion. The person you're about to meet might accuse the federal government of economic malpractice. He is economist Alan Smith, who says there is no surplus, that it's all a big fat myth. His book is entitled The Alleged Budget Surplus, Social Security, and Voodoo Economics. Dr. Smith joins us from Fort Myers, Florida. He taught economics for 30 years, retiring from Eastern Illinois University in 1998 to write, and you wrote this book entitled, once again, The Alleged Budget Surpluses, Social Security, and Voodoo Economics, all of which suggests you're probably not elated over President Clinton's announcement today of $19 billion more in the surplus since June.
Today, I haven't seen the breakdown in terms of the amount that is off budget and the amount that is on budget, but like all the other surpluses they've been talking about, most of this is Social Security money and Social Security Trust Fund. Prior to the figures released today, in the last 40 years, we had a surplus in the operating budget of 0.7 billion or 700 million, and that came in fiscal 99. 38 years prior to that, every year had a deficit in the operating budget. This is Social Security money they're talking about and not general tax revenue.
You're saying that this money that we're hearing is a government surplus that we're paying down the federal debt with is Social Security money?
It is Social Security money, and they are not paying down the national debt. If I could, I just went on the internet to the Treasury Department's website and printed out, they have a page on there, the public debt to the penny, and they give it to, they show a public debt of 2 years ago in 1998 of $55.26 billion, and today it is $56.46. According to the Treasury Department official figures, the national debt has increased by $120 billion in this 2-year period in which Clinton says it's being paid down. What they're doing is borrowing from Social Security money, paying off what they describe as the publicly held debt, and trying to make the American people believe the debt's going down. And
well, if all of what you say is true, what do we make of these political promises of a prescription drug benefit, preschool for all, college tuition paid for, tax cuts? We heard Al Gore just a few minutes ago saying they, meaning Republicans, would squander the surpluses, and he's talking about a tax cut.
He said we'll be debt-free by 2012, and anybody can go to the internet and get this mid-session review. It's from the Office of the President, the OMB, submitted to Congress in June, and the figures in here will show that President Clinton is showing an increase in the national debt between 2000 and 2012 of about close to an additional $1 trillion.
So we're being misled by the politicians with all these campaign promises.
We are being totally deceived. I think this is the biggest deception in American history. It started back about 10 years ago under President Bush. At the time, the Social Security surpluses first came into being. I think what the American people need to know, and most don't seem to know, and I don't hear it any place in the news, is this so-called surplus all originated as a result of legislation passed in 1983 in reaction to a presidential commission headed by Alan Greenspan in 1982, which indicated we were going to have major problems with Social Security when the baby boomers retire, beginning about 2010. So they took action, they raised tax rates and so forth. Every bit of this surplus is a planned surplus, and it is in the Social Security. I don't know the figures today, but as of last year, the only surplus that was not in Social Security was 0.7 billion or 700 million, and we had spent 4,600 billion of red ink in the last 20 years.
I certainly would agree with you. We're not hearing any of this in the news. I'm involved in the news. Are you a voice crying in the wilderness? And if not, why haven't we seen a presidential candidate, any presidential candidate, talk about this?
I think because there's only two explanations. One, they don't know the George W. Bush's early proposal for the massive tax cut. That was just an unthinkable. That's more Reaganomics. It's exactly the same thing Ronald Reagan said. And when Ronald Reagan came into office, we had accumulated $1 trillion in debt. We now have $5.6 trillion. 4.6 trillion of that, or 82%, has come under Clinton, Bush, and Reagan. And the American people seem to be under the impression that we don't have a debt because of the lack of a current deficit.
I can hear boomers now, and there are between 70 and 80 million of them, saying if the Social Security surplus is being used to pay down the debt, what about my Social Security?
Well, not only that, Social Security money has all been used for general operating purposes since it first came up back in the the late 80s. President Bush, at the time he was in office, he said, read my lips, no new taxes, and yet he spent a substantial amount of the increased revenue from Social Security, the surplus that came along. Senator Daniel Moynihan at that time actually suggested that we repeal that Social Security tax increase to keep them from getting it. So we started back in the Bush administration, pulling the wool over the American people's eyes, and it's been going on ever since.
Is there danger for the future?
There is a big danger because our economy right now is healthy, extremely healthy, but the budget of the United States government is probably the worst it's ever been in terms of indebtedness, and any actions taken by the government does have an impact on the economy. And I think that either the plans of either of the two candidates will derail this economy and put us back into a recession and major problems.
But we all thought because of the economy, because of more jobs, because of more people working and paying taxes and corporate profits up, corporate taxes up, that's the reason why we have these surpluses.
No.
No.
That is, the reason is the result of the 1983 tax increase. It is the reason that we had the tiny surplus last year, and probably of the amount announced today. When they release the figures, they'll tell us how much of that $230 billion is in the Social Security fund and how much is in the general operating budget. My guess is there's not more than $30 billion there, and we would expect that to be the case when the economy is at a point with the lowest unemployment in 30 years. But it won't continue. Recessions always follow expansions, and we'll be back in deficit territory before very long, whether we have any tax cuts or not. And the tax cuts will just make it worse.
A dire warning from economist Alan Smith. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
The book, The Alleged Budget Surplus, Social Security, and Voodoo Economics.
Materializes, we will eventually have no choice but to make significant structural adjustments in the major retirement programs.
Strong words from Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan yesterday in his testimony before Congress. But what form should those, quote, specific structural adjustments take? Joining us to debate the Social Security issue is Richard Jackson. He's senior advisor at the Concord Coalition, a group that has made very clear their displeasure with the deficits, and economist Alan Smith, author of The Looting of Social Security, How the Government is Draining America's Retirement Account. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Smith, let me begin with you. What do you think about what Alan Greenspan had to say?
Well, let me begin by saying there's nobody more concerned about the gigantic deficits than myself. I've spent the last 25 years of my life crusading for economic education and sound government policies. This country has been totally irresponsible for the last 20-some years. The deficit problem has to be resolved. However, the problem is not Social Security. Social Security is not the villain. It's not the solution. Right here is the problem. My new book, The Looting of Social Security. The government has borrowed, embezzled, stolen, whatever word you want to use, $1.5 trillion of Social Security money. Alan Greenspan should be ashamed of himself for what he's not telling the American people. In 1982, he chaired the commission. President.
Mr. Jackson, do you want to respond there?
Yes. The chairman is absolutely right. Social Security is unsustainable in its current form. In the long run, we're going to need to reduce benefits or raise contributions. The problem is that Social Security is a pay-as-you-go program that taxes current workers to pay for benefits to current retirees. And pay-as-you-go programs work fine when there are a lot of young workers and relatively few retirees. But as society ages and the ratio of workers to contributors falls, they can become a heavy burden. It's a bit like a chain letter that's running out of new joiners. The whole system can come crashing down.
But what about the point that other folks like Mr. Smith has made in print, where he says there's been money that was supposed to be put aside back when Alan Greenspan and company had made those recommendations in '82 that were supposed to prevent something like this from happening?
The sad truth is that there is no way to prevent Congress from spending the Social Security surplus. Social Security is not an earned right. It's a legislated entitlement. The Supreme Court has ruled that participants don't have a contractual claim to benefits, despite all of the misleading government rhetoric about contributions and insurance. FICA is a tax. As such, government owns it, and government can spend and will spend what it owns. If the Congress is guilty, it's guilty of fraudulent advertising, not embezzlement.
Mr. Smith, you hear that? It's not an earned right. You're out of luck.
I totally disagree. Social Security is not a pay-as-you-go system. It's been working that way. It was designed and it's supposed to be a self-funding. The money for Social Security comes out of a special payroll tax paid by working Americans. That fund tax was increased in 1983.
But Mr. Smith, let me ask you this. The point that he's making is that was all what was supposed to happen. And we know what was supposed to happen.
That's what the law requires also.
But it didn't happen. So here we sit. What should we do? Should we raise the retirement age? People live a lot longer than...
The government should pay back the $1.5 trillion that they've stolen from the Social Security.
But is that realistic? You think Congress is really going to do that?
It is absolutely realistic if the American people get angry enough to show what's happened. That money has been stolen from the American people. It is a self-funding program, and they have paid enough money into it.
If I may interject.
Go ahead, please.
Under current law, Congress is obligated to pay back that money. The trust fund does not contain real assets, but it does contain budget authority. It gives Social Security a claim on future tax dollars. It will pay back that money, but it will pay it back by raising taxes on our children and grandchildren. If you want to get out of this box, you have to take the ownership of the money away from government and give it to individuals. You need to transition, at least in part, to a funded system of personal accounts, because personal accounts constitute constitutionally protected property and are thus a lockbox that no politician can pick. You cannot design a government lockbox.
Mr. Smith, what do you think about personal accounts for individuals instead?
Absolutely, that will speed up the time that we're going to have problems with this. The Bush tax cuts are the problem here. Americans have to know this. Social Security dollars paid by Americans.
Are the tax cuts the problem?
Yes, they're going to fund that tax cut.
The tax cuts are part of the near-term deficit problem, and if made permanent, will become part of the long-term deficit problem. But we face a more fundamental issue here, which is the structural budget deficit, which over the long run is driven by entitlement spending on Social Security and on Medicare. And as the population ages, as boomers retire, these programs are not sustainable in their current form.
Mr. Smith, let me ask you this. He raised the question, Mr. Jackson said essentially, you got the last word, but very quickly, taxes would have to go up. You're willing to burden the rest of the country with more taxes to pay for Social Security?
No, we repeal most of the Bush tax cuts.
That's raising taxes.
You call it whatever you want to. It's money that's been stolen from the American people, and the American people deserve to have that repaid.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Alan Smith, economist and author of The Looting of Social Security, and Richard Jackson is the senior advisor at the Concord Coalition.
Now, Darren, I'm going to ask you this question. I feel so confident that you can get this. And people think we know the answer. We do not know the answer to these questions, and I prove that often. All right. Who received the Social Security number with the Social Security card with the lowest number? 001010001.
I don't know her name, but I believe it was a woman. There it is.
Got it. Grace Owen. I wonder why she was first. Maybe she was the first to apply. First to apply. Grace Owen of Concord, New Hampshire in November 1936. I don't believe that the first payment was made. The first Social Security check was issued until 1940. But anyway, there we go. We're talking about Social
Somebody who knows an awful lot about it and has characterized it as a shakedown of working people, maybe not when it started, but certainly in latter years, is Alan W. Smith. He's author of The Looting of Social Security, joining us from a lot springier place,
That's right.
Tampa, Florida.
Hi, Alan.
Good morning,
Hi.
Alan.
You are a troublemaker.
Oh, yes.
I'm only kidding, Alan. Give us some. You are saying that the Social Security fund is being pilfered and has been pilfered by a number of administrations. Give us a little background, if you would, Alan.
Okay, yeah. The background goes back to 1982 when Alan Greenspan co-chaired with Senator Moynihan a presidential commission to study Social Security in terms of the long term and what the effect of the baby boom generation would be. They saw that there would be a problem when the baby boomers got here, so they decided that it would be necessary to prepay or build up a reserve to handle this.
Yeah.
In 1983, Congress enacted that legislation. That was fixed. The thing that Greenspan is now saying, the baby boomer problem, that was fixed in 1983. It has generated, those higher taxes generated approximately $1.5 trillion of surplus Social Security money.
That's good.
Which is supposed to be there to dip into. It's not there. Every penny of it is gone.
Where did it go?
Alan,
Where did it go?
Hold on, Alan. That brings to mind what we heard during the 2000 election campaign from then Vice President Al Gore. We kept hearing about the Social Security lockbox, but if your book is correct and my memory serves me, that didn't even exist in 2000.
It didn't exist then. I think what the issue had come up, and Gore was saying, okay, from now on, we're going to put this money in a lockbox, and George W. Bush says, me too. They both promised not to touch Social Security. Well, George W. Bush has so far looted approximately $500 billion, and this money is all going to finance his tax cuts, which go primarily to the richest 1% of the American population.
But it isn't
Here we go
just
with the rich people
George
again.
W. Bush who did it. Bill Clinton did it. I mean, it's been going on for a while now.
It's been going on since the surpluses first started to show up in '83, or shortly after '83, to a small extent in the second term of Reagan, but there wasn't that much surplus yet. George Bush Sr., a great deal throughout the Bill Clinton years, and what's happened is that Social Security planned surplus is getting larger and larger.
Alan, isn't part of the problem that the fact that in 1940 it took 42 people working to fund one person. In 1950 it was 16 people to fund one person's benefits. In the year 2004 there were 3 people working for every benefit. In the year 2030 there will only be 2 people working because of 77 million baby boomers retiring by then. So part of it is structural, is it not? Whether the money's gone anywhere or not, we don't have enough people working to fund this deal.
What you're saying is true, but that was taken care of. That was taken into consideration. They had those projections.
Okay.
And enough, the Social Security fund on paper is solvent until the year 2042. Another 38 years. There wouldn't be a problem if the money was there that's supposed to be there.
Where did it go, Alan? Where is it? Where's all my dough?
Where did it go?
Yeah.
It has been used into the General Revenue Fund. That money was supposed to be set aside. Excuse me.
That's okay.
But instead, it went into the General Revenue Fund. It has been used in the past primarily to fund other government programs. George W. Bush has used it for the tax cut. He told the American people that there was surplus money. The only surplus money we had was that Social Security.
Look at that roll. Look at that roll of checks, Alan. Ching, baby.
According to Social Security, Alan Smith, 72% of retirees opt to take the reduced benefits at age 62 than to wait till 65, which will be going up to 67 over the next several years. Is there some way that that may be also adding to the problems with Social Security, or is that almost an add-on to the problem?
I don't think the problem with Social Security has not changed since 1983 when it was fixed. It was fixed until the year 2042. Enough money has been paid. Let me just read a short excerpt from a speech that was given 2 weeks ago today on the U.S. Senate floor by Senator Kent Conrad of North Dakota. This sums it up. He says, in effect, what he, the president, is doing is taking money from Social Security, raised by payroll taxes, paid overwhelmingly by middle-income people. He is using it to fund tax cuts that are income tax cuts for overwhelmingly the wealthiest. And 33% of the benefit goes to the top 1%, those earning over $337,000. We have...
Alan, it's only a one-hour program.
We're going to run out of time here, and we want to get a couple of more questions in.
I get your point.
Would adding federal and state workers who do not pay Social Security taxes help? And should Alan Greenspan, after proposing an increase so that they could raise the FICA taxes in 1983, have any leg to stand on in proposing now that we should cut the benefits for people going forward?
No, and that's why I would like to read this one other short paragraph. It says, we have the spectacle of people through their payroll taxes, funding an income tax reduction that goes primarily to the wealthiest among us, and then creating a circumstance in which the chairman of the Federal Reserve comes in and says, oops, we are overcommitted. We now have to cut Social Security benefits. Now that's it in the nutshell. Those words should appear on the front page of every paper in America. If the American people have a right to know that they are being ripped off by their own government.
Alan, thank you very much. He's the author of The Looting of Social Security, a very good book. It is certainly thought-provoking. My bottom line is if there are 40 million people, and by then, by the next generation, many more than that receiving Social Security, the politicians will never let it die, because $1 equals 1 vote. Coming up.